and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 146, The Spear of Destiny. Last week, we covered the wide range of reforms Julian initiated after becoming emperor. Though he is usually remembered as the man who tried to stem the tide of Christianity, we should not forget that he was interested in more than just religion. And given enough time, it is possible that we could have been sitting here talking about Julian as a major transformative figure. But instead, we talk about him merely as a brief detour, an accidental left turn, noticed and corrected within a block of the mistake. This week, we will get into why Julian's imperial course correction never got the empire further down his pagan principate side road. In the end, it wasn't because of institutional barriers, entrenched interests, or even the irresistible destiny of Christianity. It was because of a forgotten breastplate and an anonymously thrown spear. After a frustrating winter spent butting heads with the citizens of Antioch, Julian was eager to leave behind the aggravating belligerency of his fellow citizens and focus his attention on a much easier enemy to grapple with, the Sassanids. He didn't have to worry about placating the Sassanids or making friends with the Sassanids or even caring what the Sassanids thought about his reform agenda. He just needed to beat the crap out of the Sassanids. I imagine that as much as Julian was looking forward to the political bounce he would get from a successful campaign in the East, that he was also looking forward to the cathartic relief he would get from a good, hard fight. Much to Julian's consternation, however, the Sassanids were presently trying to duck that fight. The Persian king Shapur II spent most of his epic reign, which was an amazing 70 years long, vacillating between aggression and pacifism towards Rome, and it appears that with the death of his old enemy Constantius II, that the king was ready to once again enter one of his passive phases. His recent victories, which had included the sack of Amida, had turned out to have been of the Pyrrhic variety. That is, the costs of the campaign far outweighed the benefits. Further fighting at this point would probably only shift the border between Rome and Persia a few yards in either direction. So, what was the point? Shapur reached out to Julian and tried to work out a peace agreement that would satisfy both leaders, but Julian was not having it. He had come east to make war on the Sassanids, not to make peace with the Sassanids. Though the terms were reasonable, and it is hard to see how rejecting them benefited Rome in the final analysis, Julian had designed a game plan to take him through the early years of his reign, and that game plan said very clearly, win a great victory against Persia. So Julian refused to listen to terms. If I make peace, I won't be able to win a great victory against Persia, and it says very clearly right here that I need to win a great victory against Persia. You get the feeling like Shapur could have offered control of the whole Sassanid Empire and promised to become the emperor's private footstool, and Julian still would have demanded a war. So in March of 363, Julian left Antioch at the head of an army, telling those lousy ingrate Antiochians on his way out the door that he was never, ever coming back. Though the estimates for the size of Julian's army vary from a low of 65,000 to a high of 90,000, there is one thing we can be sure of. Julian was mustering every available soldier he could get his hands on. He even demanded that the king of Armenia send an auxiliary army to help shore up the Roman ranks. Julian wanted nothing less than a total, complete, and overwhelming victory, and he did not want to leave anything to chance. However, though an army the size of Julian's eastern invasion force, whatever size it actually was, would have made the emperor an unstoppable juggernaut back in Gaul, out here in Syria, it made him merely equal to the task. By most estimates, the army Shapur had in the field was able to match the Romans man for man. When you throw in the fact that most of the soldiers in the Roman army were either recently recruited or had been transferred over from the west and were unused to desert fighting, well, even 100,000 men might not have been equal to the task. In other words, Julian might have thought he wasn't leaving anything to chance, but he was still going to need a healthy dose of luck to pull this thing off. Beyond questions about whether his army could do what Julian wanted them to do, the emperor is often criticized for marching east without a clear strategic aim beyond victory for victory's sake. Sadly, for the men of the Roman army, though, no one realized quite how rudderless this war actually was in the beginning, because Julian appeared to have a very clear idea of what he was doing. He was going to attack the Sassanid capital of Ctesiphon. To pull this off, the emperor knew that he would need to keep Shapur off his back for a little while. The Persian king was up in the north near the Armenian border with the bulk of his veteran army, and that is exactly where Julian wanted him to stay. To keep Shapur in place, Julian peeled off 20 to 30,000 of his men, the variation depending on how large you think his overall army was, and sent them to feign an attack on Medea. The emperor hoped that in the fog of war, this decoy invasion force would be taken for the main invasion force, and confound Shapur's reaction time accordingly. Even if the king saw through the Medea feint, Julian reckoned that Shapur would, at the very least, assume the Romans would be taking the easy route down the Tigris to attack Ctesiphon, and so, while the decoy army marched northeast, Julian himself chose the tougher but less expected route down the Euphrates. Despite his lack of a coherent strategy, Julian did not neglect his logistical responsibilities, and after reaching the Euphrates, he rendezvoused with a fleet of some 1,000 ships that he had ordered constructed to keep the food and munitions flowing. With his years in Gaul marked by constant supply problems, Julian was making damn sure that he would not have to worry about some latter-day Barbatio seizing his grain and burning his supply transports. The preparations were complete by early April, and Julian spent the next month methodically making his way south towards the Sassanid capital. As the Romans marched, they seized control of any cities or military outposts they happened by. Since the majority of these were only lightly garrisoned, the resistance they met during these first few weeks was sporadic and short-lived. It wasn't until they were closing in on Ctesiphon that Julian and his army finally ran into some real pushback. 2 cities in a row shut up their gates and attempted to resist, and though in both cases the Romans won after a quick, hard battle, the fights did lay bare the realities of siege warfare in the desert heat. As the Roman army neared Ctesiphon, the big question became how to get his men and his 1,000 ships over to the capital. You see, part of the reason the approach along the Tigris was easier was because Ctesiphon is actually located on the Tigris. Having tens of thousands of soldiers and 1,000 supply ships doesn't do you much good if you're, on the complete wrong river. The obvious answer was to take the long way around. That is, head down to the confluence of the rivers and then turn around and row upstream. But that route was arduous and fraught with danger, and Julian had no intention of exposing his army if he didn't have to. And he was pretty sure that he didn't have to. You see, Julian knew a little secret that had been lost to the ages. Once upon a time, the kings of Persia had built a canal connecting the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. But due to excessive flooding, the canal had long ago been blocked up, and now sat around as an innocuous dry ditch. Julian located this royal canal, and had his men knock out the dam that kept the long-forgotten channel dry. Just like that, the Romans had a straight path from here to there. Thus, in mid-May of 363, the Sassanid garrison defending Ctesiphon was dismayed to discover a massive Roman invasion fleet descending on them not from the north or from the south, where attacks were to be expected, but from the west, which, wait, what? With Shapur stalled, but by this point no longer completely fooled, by the decoy army in the north, the soldiers defending Ctesiphon were also dismayed to learn that they were on their own. At this point, Julian had to have been delighted by his prospects, and even more delighted by the result of the initial encounter between his men and the Ctesiphon garrison. The Persians lined up for battle in front of the city, but rather than attack them directly, Julian spent the day lulling them into a false sense of security by making a big show of settling in and not paying much attention to the opposing army. But as soon as night fell, Julian ordered a surprise attack. The resulting battle lasted well into the next day, and eventually the Sassanids were pushed back into the city. But critically, the Romans did not immediately follow up this success, and they retired before capturing the city in one fell swoop. Which is unfortunate, because that day's battle would prove to be the high point of Julian's invasion. From that moment on, it was pretty much all downhill. The first thing that struck the Roman officers the next morning, and the first thing that makes us think that perhaps Julian had not thought this through fully, was the impressive defensive fortifications Ctesiphon now boasted. You'll recall from past episodes that sacking Ctesiphon was practically a rite of passage for Roman emperors there for a while, and really, all they had to do was show up and the city would surrender. But the advanced fortification techniques that had begun cropping up at the end of the 3rd century were not a strictly Roman phenomenon. Even with his full army, and he was still waiting for the decoy army to rejoin his main force, it would take time and effort to dislodge the Sassanids now that they were settling in for a siege. More to the point, the Romans would probably be unable to take the city before Shapur arrived with the main Persian army. And even if Shapur took his time getting to Ctesiphon, the royal canal, the one that had been closed because of excessive flooding, well, it was now flooding and creating a malaria-ridden swamp for the Romans to camp in. So, where did that leave them? What was the plan now? Initially, Julian argued in favor of launching the siege anyway. But in the command tent, he was pummeled by a nearly unanimous officer corps that told him in no uncertain terms that, in their professional opinion, a siege would be suicide. Finally, Julian relented and agreed to call off the assault. So, okay, now that that's settled, what's the new plan? Sacking Ctesiphon would have been nice, but what was the greater purpose it would have served? It's clear we need to change our approach, so what's our overarching strategic goal? Maybe we can rejigger our methods and achieve the same result? Are we trying to conquer Persia? Are we trying to remove Shapur from power? Are we simply trying to force him to give us a better peace deal? What are we doing out here? Though we do not have a solid record of these meetings, it appears that Julian did not really have answers to these questions. Sacking Ctesiphon had likely been an end unto itself. Now that he had run into a wall, literally a big, thick wall, Julian wasn't sure what to do. He was going to have to improvise his way out of this, and the plan he came up with was pretty clearly not in the original playbook. Going back the way that they had come would have been too difficult. So the emperor decided to lead his army up the Tigris River, which was the quickest route back to Armenia and back to safety. The Roman soldiers were understandably skeptical of this plan. I mean, isn't that the direction Shapur is coming from? But they went from skeptical to appalled when they learned the next part of the plan, that Julian was also planning to burn the 1,000 supply ships. It would have been much too difficult to haul them all back upriver, and leaving them behind meant leaving them gift-wrapped for Shapur. But the cold logic of command is sometimes lost on the average grunt. All the grunt sees is that the things that bring him food are going up in smoke. So on top of having to call an audible in the middle of a campaign, Julian also had to deal with the fact that his troops were now questioning his sanity. And then things got really bad. When Shapur's scouts reported back that the Romans were heading north up the Tigris, The king responded with a harsh but obvious strategy. Despite Roman fears to the contrary, Shapur was still not looking to initiate a set-piece battle, at least not yet. So he ordered his men to pour into the countryside and burn every single edible thing they could find. This scorched earth tactic was rough on his own people, but it was even rougher on the Romans. Julian had been expecting to be able to live off the land until they reached Armenia, or at least until they met Shapur in battle. But instead, the Sassanids were keeping their distance, offering no terms, and watching as the Romans starved. By the middle of June 363, the situation was desperate, and it was at this point that Julian met his fate. Once he determined that the Romans had been worn down by their grueling march north, Shapur finally ordered his army to begin harassing the legions. Skirmishes in the front and in the rear of the Roman line gave way to heavier fighting, and pretty soon the two sides were locked in a running battle. The Romans desperately attempted to push north, but could make almost no headway, and they were averaging just a few miles a day. But despite the bleakness of the situation, Julian never gave up. He never locked himself up in his tent, he never tried to run for it, and by all accounts, he never even hinted that he would do either of those things. He was constantly out in front of his men, leading them, fighting with them, encouraging them. There is absolutely no denying that he handled the situation as admirably as a man in his situation could. But there is also no denying that in the end, this admirable conduct is what killed him. The details of Julian's death are vague. Despite the fact that Ammianus Marcellinus was actually there and fought in the fateful battle, we still don't know exactly what happened, which is understandable. We are talking about a clash between tens of thousands of men here. Unless he was right next to the emperor, even Marcellinus's account is going to be second-hand, and he wasn't right next to the emperor. That said, the standard account is that on June 26, 363 AD, the Sassanids hit the Romans with a multi-pronged assault. As Julian was trying to rally the men on one side, they were attacked from another. When he rushed over to rally the men on that side, they were attacked from a third side. In the midst of all this rushing around, Julian had neglected to don his breastplate. When word came of the attack, he had simply dashed off to lead his men. Admirable, but more than a little short-sighted. He was on his horse in the thick of the fray on that third front, when a spear came flying out of the Persian line and struck Julian in the side. Marcellinus says specifically that the spear grazed the emperor's arm and then lodged itself in his liver. Julian tried to remove the spear, but the blade was too long to get a firm grip, and he cut his hands in the process. Weak from shock and a loss of blood, the emperor fainted, then regained consciousness long enough to announce that his wound was not mortal, and then he fainted again. Julian was then rushed away from the scene, and his doctor immediately began to save the emperor's life. In his biography of Julian the Apostate, The Last Pagan, Adrian Murdoch spends a good amount of time at the end of the book trying to parse through the different versions of Julian's death to try and reach some tentative conclusion. Though Marcellinus is usually deferred to when it comes to Julian, Murdoch argues that the soldier historian's belief that the emperor died on the same day he was wounded is suspect. First of all, the cause of Julian's death is described as strangulation, rather than something more directly related to the wound. This points to an infection, and infection is going to need time to build up. The reason this even matters is because as he lay dying, Julian, surprisingly, and not a little bit recklessly, never did name an heir. In Marcellinus's version, Julian spends his final evening engaged in some romantic deathbed philosophizing, but he never even hints at who ought to lead the army and the empire when he inevitably dies. This seems so ridiculously short-sighted that it calls the whole version of the story into question. If, however, Julian spent 3 days in bed slowed by a wound that did not necessarily look like it was killing him until, whoops, it killed him, then the fact that he did not name an heir makes sense. Put simply, the emperor did not believe he was dying, and so he did not name a successor. And this is why I tend to believe that Julian died on June the 29th, 363 AD, 2 days after receiving the mortal wound. Either way, though, he was 31 years old and had ruled the empire for just a year and a half. Julian's short reign is unique in Roman history. Previous emperors had initiated fundamental changes to the way the empire operated, and previous emperors had of course served very short terms of office. But never had they done both at the same time. Julian had tried to pull off a system-wide overhaul of the empire that, had it succeeded, would have made his reign a key hinge point on the imperial timeline. Maybe his overhaul would not have been as grand as, say, Augustus's or Diocletian's had been, but it certainly might have had the power to diminish the prominent part Constantine plays in the history of the Western world. Perhaps it might have even served as a bookend to an anomalous Christian era for the empire. But the other emperors who dreamed big had the luck to serve a long time and see their reform cemented into the bedrock of the system. Julian dreamed big, and then he died young. I honestly think that in terms of ambition of vision and brevity of rule, the only one who matches Julian is, and I know this is going to sound crazy, Elagabalus, who, like Julian, tried to reinvent Roman religion, but died before his reforms could firmly take root in the system. However, other than that superficial similarity, there is really nothing to connect the half-mad teenager Elagabalus to the genuinely conscientious Julian, so I really think that Julian the Apostate is a unique figure in Roman history, which makes him interesting, which means that we will never stop poring over his year and a half in office and wondering what might have been. All that said, however, in June of 363, the Roman army did not have the luxury of pondering what Julian's place in history was going to be. They were stranded in enemy territory, surrounded, and flailing. The emperor was dead, and no heir was in place. In other words, disaster loomed. Next week, Julian's officers will attempt to pick up the pieces and avert said disaster. But given the circumstances and the fact that the legitimate imperial line was now suddenly extinct, well, in trying to solve the problem of what they were going to do next, they may have wound up simply swapping one disaster for another. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 147, Capitulation. Last week, we left off with the Eastern legions in a bit of a scrape. The Emperor Julian was dead, he had not named a successor, and they were surrounded on all sides by a hostile Sassanid army. Any one of those things taken alone would have been pretty rotten, but taken together, well, let's break out the popcorn and see what happens next. After news of Julian's death got out, the senior officers of the army got together and tried to figure out what the hell they were going to do next. Naturally, the first order of business was figuring out who was in charge. After all, a good chain of command can't just peter out into a mud puddle of cavalry officers and supply chiefs. Someone's got to be the eye in the pyramid. With no imperial relatives around to make the choice easy on them, the officers turned to the most obvious non-royal candidate, the senior Praetorian prefect, Saturninus Secundus Salutius. The prefect was universally respected, and from the moment Julian had been named Caesar, Salutius had been one of the emperor's closest and most influential advisors. He had been so trusted, in fact, that when Julian had formed the commission to oversee the post-Constantius purge of the imperial court, Salutius had been its chairman. Elevated to the rank of Praetorian Prefect of the East after the commission wrapped up its business, Salutius was the highest-ranking official in the tent after Julian died, so the senior officers of the army tried to make him emperor. But Salutius begged off, pleading that he was too old and too sick for such an exhausting job. Also, man, is now really the best time to become emperor? So the officers went back to the drawing board and came up with a surprising new candidate, a man who at the very least would not be able to cite arthritis as an excuse to get out of the promotion. Captain of the imperial bodyguard, Flavius Jovianus. The choice of Jovian was surprising, not just because he was only 31 years old, but also because he was a relative unknown. That is, he was not some high official or long-serving officer with a lifetime of experience under his belt and friends in all corners of the empire. Plus, while he was a fine officer, he had likely risen as high as he had, as fast as he had, not because of merit, but because his father had served for years in that same post. So though his sudden elevation to the purple is surprising, I reckon that Jovian got the call for two main reasons. First, because there were enough internal rivalries between the officers that, after Salutius, any unanimous choice was going to have to be a lesser candidate because all the better candidates had enemies in the room. And second, again, man, is now really the best time to become emperor? Ammianus Marcellinus reports that Jovian was such an unexpected choice that when the soldiers cheered his elevation, it is possible that they completely misunderstood who they were cheering, that some thought they were hailing a high notary named Jovianus, while others thought they were cheering a recovered Julian. But despite coming out of nowhere, Jovian was not exactly coming out of nowhere. He was born around 331 in Illyria, making him roughly the same age as Julian, and as I mentioned, he was the son of a highly regarded officer who had risen to become captain of Constantius II's personal bodyguard. Jovian was also, coincidentally enough, the son-in-law of the commander of the Sirmium garrison, who Julian had kidnapped just prior to taking the city in mid-361. There are two interesting things to note about Jovian's rise in the ranks that speak to Julian's character. First, Julian was not necessarily one to hold a family grudge. Both Jovian's father and father-in-law had been loyal to Constantius II, which you would think would be the sort of thing that would actually preclude Jovian from being promoted to such a key position, but apparently it was not. Second, Jovian was openly Christian, which contradicts any notion that Julian was an anti-Christian extremist. He was anti-Christian, sure, but a good officer was a good officer, and good officers were in short supply. The presence in the army of Valentinian, who we will get to in a moment, further speaks to the surprisingly limited extent of Julian's religious intolerance, which is to say that when push came to shove, for Julian, talent often trumped religion. Before I get off this point, I should note also, though, that the same was true for Constantine and his sons. Yes, they were Christian and promoted Christianity and tried to push paganism to the fringes, but during the period between the Milvian Bridge and the revolt of Julian, polytheist officers and polytheist officials continued to occupy key positions in the military and in the government. The emperors were pragmatic men ruling in difficult times, and talent was not just something you could discard, even if there was a larger religious battle to fight. In terms of the sheer ugliness of the situation an emperor walked into upon donning the purple, there were few situations uglier than the one Jovian walked into. Probably only the ascension of Gallus, who came to power after the disaster at Abritus, rivals Jovian's ascension in terms of its terrible no-goodness. In both cases, an emperor was dead at the enemy's hand, that enemy was still at hand, and the Roman army was mentally and physically broken. Which is why only Gallus could probably appreciate what Jovian did next. Certainly none of Jovian's contemporaries demonstrated any appreciation for it at all. It's easy to demand vigor and resiliency, and if that fails, noble self-sacrifice, when you're safely tucked thousands of miles away at the imperial capital. Much harder when you're actually standing there, plausibly facing total annihilation. The new emperor at first attempted to continue the retreat towards Armenia, but the loss of Julian had destroyed morale, so he did what he no doubt felt he had to do. He sent envoys to Shapur and asked what the price would be for safe passage home. Shapur was delighted by this turn of events and replied that the terms would be simple. Give back all the territory ceded to Galerius by the Treaty of Nispus, exactly what the Sassanid king had demanded of Constantius back in 357. This meant the Romans would have to evacuate all the fortress cities that had acted as their forward line of defense and pull out of all the territory they occupied on the far side of the Tigris. The one added term Shapur tacked on was a guarantee of Armenian neutrality in all future conflicts between the two empires. The terms were harsh and essentially amounted to total capitulation for the Romans, but Jovian had little choice. For him, the deal boiled down to capitulate with your army left intact, or capitulate after it has been destroyed. Sure, in the latter case, maybe you get to go out fighting, but was that really in the best interests of the empire long term? To lose its whole eastern army in battle just for the sheer stubborn glory of it all? Jovian, probably glad Shapur wasn't asking for more, accepted the terms. The Romans were granted safe passage back to Syria. Julian had gone out looking for victory for victory's sake, and the army instead returned with nothing to show for it but defeat for the sake of survival. Now, I would be remiss if I did not point out that there is another way to look at the Roman surrender. For example, Ammianus Marcellinus states that Jovian misunderstood the tactical realities of the situation, that the new emperor was mistaken in his belief that the cause was hopeless, because Shapur was actually much weaker than he appeared. And it is worth asking a few questions. If the cause was so hopeless, why hadn't the Sassanids crushed the Romans yet? If the cause was so hopeless, why had Shapur asked only for withdrawal from the land beyond the Tigris? Why not demand all of Mesopotamia? Why not demand the Roman army lay down its arms before they headed home? The answers to these questions no doubt lie in Shapur's own evaluation of the situation, which likely jibes with Marcellinus's assessment. That the Romans were run down, but they weren't beaten yet. That it was best not to risk asking the Romans for too much, because if they decided they had to fight on, well, this isn't exactly a case of the ant begging the foot for mercy. Shapur clearly did not think he held the lives of the Romans in the palm of his hand. Otherwise, the terms would have been even harsher. Indeed, if Jovian had decided to keep on fighting, it is very possible that the fortunes of war could have turned this all from a Roman debacle into a Roman victory, a fact the Sassanid king must have been acutely aware of. So, when the emperor came calling, Shapur jumped at the chance to end this thing on favorable terms. Remember, he had never wanted this war in the first place because he did not think he was strong enough to beat the Romans without it costing him big time. All that said, however, a strategy that pins its hopes on the fortunes of war suddenly turning your way risks an awful lot. In this case, it meant risking the safety of the entire Eastern Empire. If the expeditionary army was destroyed, then there would be nothing to stop Shapur from sacking Antioch, and maybe even from sacking Alexandria. It was just that simple. At a minimum, any further fighting would just mean more dead Roman soldiers. Not dead for any purpose, but dead because the invasion had been a bad idea, poorly executed, and no one wanted to admit it. Sometimes you just have to grit your teeth, tip your cap, and go home. And what was the cost? Some land beyond the Tigris? No one was ceding Syria. No one was handing over Egypt. Jovian was accepting mild defeat, rather than risk appalling defeat. Was it the optimum outcome? Of course not. Especially when you factor in that the surrender, of course, emboldened Shapur and left later Romans hungry for revenge, which virtually guaranteed continued strife along the eastern frontier for another generation. And, as you may or may not know, that strife will one day prove so distracting that the issue of what to do about the horde of Goths that just showed up on the Danube asking for asylum will be badly mishandled. And I mean badly mishandled. Who knows? Maybe a mutually destructive fight in the desert would have led to an exhausted peace in the east that would have left the Romans free to deal with the incoming Goths responsibly. But now I'm just kind of wandering off topic. Jovian made the deal. The Roman army headed home intact. When Jovian and his exhausted men arrived back in Roman territory, the reaction to his peace deal was immediate and negative. The ruling narrative quickly became that Jovian was a coward who had sold out the empire to save his own skin. In an age when military victory and political legitimacy were one and the same, just ask Julian, Jovian had committed the unforgivable sin of surrender. It would have been interesting to see just how long Jovian would have been able to stay in power given this albatross hanging around his neck. We'll never know, of course, because, well, we'll get to that in a second, but it is hard to imagine too much time passing before Jovian faced either a palace coup or a military revolt. By all accounts, the emperor was acutely aware of his unpopularity, but before heading to Constantinople, he lingered in Antioch and began the process of returning the empire to Christianity. The fact that he was personally a Christian had to have played a major role in his subsequent edicts, but it's easy to imagine the new emperor also believed he was laying the foundations for his own base of power. Reinstate the Christians, get the support of the Christians. Isn't that how these things work? To this end, Julian annulled most of the restrictions on Christian practices and revived most of the restrictions on pagan practices. The empire would never again return to its polytheistic roots. In November of 363, Jovian felt that things were settled enough in the east that he could afford to head to Constantinople and face his political unpopularity head on. He knew that he was likely walking into a viper's nest of backstabbers, because, after all, in addition to being the man who had surrendered the Eastern legions, he wasn't even a member of the Constantinian dynasty, so who did he think he was anyway? It was going to be a tough sell, but Jovian was a tough guy, and ready to do what he had to do to secure the throne for years to come, except, yeah, it's not going to happen. In February of 364, Jovian was heading down the home stretch in between Ancyra and Nicaea when he suddenly died. Some sources point to carbon monoxide poisoning, while others point to poison mushrooms. A few later sources take it on faith that the emperor was assassinated, but most modern scholars seem to come down squarely on the side of a freak accident. I, for one, am under the impression that Livia did it. Whatever or whoever it was that killed Jovian, he was 32 years old when he died and had ruled the empire for just 8 months. I hate to say this because I'm fairly sympathetic to Jovian, but I think his death was a blessing for Rome. I really don't see how the empire survives the next few years or even the next few months without some kind of disastrous civil war. There had already been riots in Milan when Julian's death was announced, riots that wound up killing Jovian's father-in-law, by the way, who had been the one to read the announcement. Jovian was a political newcomer. He had no connection to the previous dynasty, and he had just surrendered to the Sassanids. You take these three things together, and you get big red flashing lights going off in the head of every ambitious general and prefect in the empire. Though Rome would still have to deal with the brief revolt of Julian's maternal cousin Procopius, I don't think that that even touches the kind of civil discord that probably would have broken out had Julian lived. That's just speculation on my part, but I think the combination of Valentinian and Valens offered a much stronger imperial hand than Jovian would have ever been able to provide. Which brings us to Valentinian and Valens. Who are Valentinian and Valens, you ask? Well, I'll tell you. The former was a highly regarded officer who was in the right place at the right time, and the latter was that guy's brother. Flavius Valentinianus had been born in 321 in Pannonia, and was the son of an important general named Gratianus. Gratianus had spent most of his career in the west, and he reached the uppermost rungs of the chain of command during the reign of Constans. Young Valentinian joined the army just after Constans took control of all the western provinces in 340, and he followed his father to postings first in North Africa and then in Britain. After Gratianus presciently retired just before the fall of Constans, we don't know where exactly Valentinian went next, but it was almost certainly somewhere along the Rhine or Danube frontier. The confusion about who was doing what when continues during the period of Magnentius's revolt. No sources speak to what, if any, role Valentinian played in the conflict, but we do know that following his victory, Constantius II confiscated the estates of Gratianus, hinting that the retired general may have been providing support for the usurping general, which was not out of the question since the two old soldiers were both veterans of the Western legions. If Valentinian joined his father's presumed support for Magnentius, it cannot have been too staunch, because the rising officer next appears in Gaul attached to Julian's army, which is not exactly the sort of promotion you'd expect for a blood enemy of the dynasty. It was in Gaul that Valentinian really began to make a name for himself. He served with distinction as a cavalry officer, almost certainly fought at the Battle of Strasbourg, and generally endeared himself to superiors and subordinates alike. The senior officers liked him because he got the job done, and the grunts liked him because of his easygoing disposition, a disposition which is kind of hard to imagine given Valentinian's ultimate cause of death. In the winter of 359-360, Valentinian was promoted to the Eastern legions, as Constantius prepared for war against the Sassanids, and he was likely already in Antioch by the time Julian revolted in January of 360. For Valentinian, the upshot of this imperial conflict was that he was immediately dismissed from service by Constantius, who was concerned that Valentinian's close ties to Julian would make him a potential snake in the grass. As with the revolt of Magnentius, we don't know what Valentinian thought about Julian's uprising, but it's possible Constantius was being overly paranoid about the whole thing, because after Julian became sole emperor, Valentinian was forced to remain in semi-exile in Egypt. As a Christian, in a time when that was suddenly a bad thing again, Valentinian's future was very much in doubt. However, as Julian was building up his war machine to go invade Persia, he recalled Valentinian to service. Like I said, good officers are good officers, whatever they believe, and Valentinian was a good officer. His reward for being such a good officer was that he got to witness firsthand the utter meltdown of the Eastern invasion, Julian's subsequent death, and the Roman army's humiliating withdrawal back to Syria. When they reached Antioch, though, Valentinian received one of the most fortuitous promotions in history. As Jovian worked through the aftermath of the failed invasion and tried to lay the groundwork for his own imperial rule, he sent Valentinian to Ancyra to command a key infantry division, which meant that when Jovian passed through a few months later and then suddenly died a few miles down the road, well, good Valentinian was right there, wasn't he? I mean, literally, physically, right there, wasn't he? The immediate response to Jovian's death was very similar to the immediate response to Julian's death. The military and political inner circle got together and tried to figure out who the next emperor was going to be. Initially, two names were put forward: Aquitius, a veteran officer, and Januarius, a relative of Jovian's who was currently overseeing supply operations in Illyria. But as the officials talked their way through the problem, Aquitius was rejected because he was a bit rough around the edges, too much soldier and not enough statesman. Then Januarius was rejected because there would be a frightening lag time between now and when we can actually drape him in the purple. No one wanted to be responsible for opening up a prolonged power vacuum. So what they needed was an experienced officer who was educated and cultured enough to survive as a politician, but who was also near enough at hand that we can get him in office like right now. And then someone mentioned Valentinian, who they had just passed a few days back. And they all liked and respected Valentinian, and the men seemed to like and respect Valentinian, and he's pretty well educated, and hey, I think we have our man. A messenger was sent at once to fetch the no doubt surprised, but apparently willing Valentinian, and on February the 26th, 364 AD, he became emperor of the Roman Empire. When he emerged to address the assembled troops, however, they greeted him more as an angry mob than as joyful subjects. With all the backroom picking of emperors lately, the soldiers were starting to feel left out of the process. But Valentinian assured them that the needs of the army would always come first, and that they had nothing to fear from Emperor Valentinian. After all, was he not one of them? With the army now pretty securely on his side, Valentinian next had to shore up political support for his new dynasty. To this end, one of his first acts as emperor was to announce that he would be appointing another emperor. With the East not at all secured, and the West shaky at best, appointing a second emperor would ensure that everyone would have the imperial authority they needed to respond to crises when they needed it. A few weeks later, Valentinian completed Jovian's journey and arrived in Constantinople, whereupon he announced his choice for co-emperor, his brother Valens, the man who, as I'm sure you already know, will one day ride out into a swarm of Goths at the disastrous Battle of Adrianople, never to return. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 148, The Cousin's Cousin. In March of 364 AD, the recently elected Emperor Valentinian promoted his brother Valens to the rank of co-Augustus. Though this was not the first time blood brothers would share control of the empire, it was the first time that blood brothers would share control of the empire without also wanting to tear each other's throats out. Caracalla and Geta, the sons of Constantine, these men were bitter, murderous rivals. Valentinian and Valens, on the other hand, would prove to be partners. The new emperors were, of course, not without their faults, but constantly trying to take each other out at the knees wasn't one of them. Their example not only built the foundations of the fairly stable Valentinian Theodosian dynasty, but it also firmly entrenched an east-west division of the empire as the permanent form of imperial administration. Aside from the few years that Theodosius will stand as the sole ruler of the empire at the end of the century, this was it. This was when East really started to become East, and West really started to become West. It didn't have to happen like it did, and at any number of points, the growing gulf between the two halves of the empire could have been narrowed rather than widened. But it didn't happen like that. And so the reign of Valentinian and Valens retroactively becomes something of a milestone. At the time, of course, it was just another day in the life of the Roman Empire. Imperial power sharing was a well-established practice, and so the fact that Valentinian and Valens were about to divide up the empire did not look to contemporaries like much of a milestone at all. After the promotion of Valens, the two new co-Augusti traveled west together on a brief tour of the Danube provinces. When they arrived at Sirmium, just 50 miles from where they had been born, they called a conference of all the senior court officials to hash out who was going to get what. As the senior Augustus, Valentinian had first dibs on territory, and he elected to take the western provinces and govern from Milan, leaving Valens to take the eastern provinces and govern from Constantinople. This seems like an odd choice for Valentinian to make, not just because Constantinople was the central capital of the empire, but because at the moment, the biggest issue facing Rome by far was how to properly manage the eastern border following Jovian's peace treaty with Shapur. You would think that as senior emperor he would want to personally be there to oversee the situation. But I think the fact that Valentinian spent almost his entire career in the West makes this choice obvious. He knew the western provinces, and he knew the people of the western provinces, and he had strong ties to the army of the western provinces, so it makes sense that he would want to rule the western provinces. Valens, on the other hand, had no strong ties one way or the other. Unlike his elder brother, he had not initially followed their father into the service, and after Valens was born in 328 AD, he apparently spent the majority of his first 30 years just kind of kicking around the family estates in Illyria. It was not until the early 360s that Valens finally joined the army, most likely on the recommendation of Valentinian, as Julian was preparing for his invasion of Persia. This meant that the only military experience Valens had prior to becoming emperor was a couple of months wandering around the desert and one good, humiliating surrender. Given this inexperience, I think Valens winds up acquitting himself fairly well over the course of his imperial career, Adrianople notwithstanding. For the rest of 364 and into the summer of 365, the brothers enjoyed a much-needed period of calm as they found their footing, established their own men in key posts, and generally got acquainted with the realities of running the Roman Empire. But the calm spell was to be short-lived. In late 365, the you-know-what hit the you-know-what, and both emperors found themselves waist-deep in the really real realities of running the Roman Empire: internal revolts and external invasions. Pretty much par for the course. We'll deal more extensively with Valentinian's problems in the West next week, because this week I want to focus on Procopius's revolt and Valens's response. But just to set the Western stage a little, Valentinian's ascension to the throne wound up triggering a whole new round of Alemanni aggression. According to Ammianus Marcellinus, the basic story is that in 365, a collection of German chiefs came around for the annual giving of gifts that cemented the friendship and partnership and blah 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 between the Alemanni and the Romans, and became mighty incensed when they saw what the new emperor Valentinian was offering. I think the modern analogy would be that the German kings were used to a nice cash bonus, and Valentinian was giving them an envelope full of Olive Garden coupons. They protested, but were dismissed without even being granted an imperial audience. On their way back home, they talked themselves into a frenzy over the insult, and resolved to teach this arrogant new emperor a lesson. As in, let's see how arrogant he is after we completely overrun Gaul. Now I should note that this might not be the whole story, or even the real story, of how the Alemanni came to want to invade the Roman provinces again. It is hard to tell sometimes how much of Marcellinus's depiction of Valentinian is really accurate, and how much of it is just negatively biased slander to make Marcellinus's hero, Julian, look even better. Apparently, though, this sort of high-handed treatment of foreign embassies was a noticeable pattern throughout Valentinian's reign. Or, at least, Marcellinus wants us to think it was a very noticeable pattern. Like I say, sometimes it's hard to tell. According to the legend, Valentinian learned that an army of Alemanni were invading on November the 1st, 365 AD. But by the end of that day, he was not preparing to march to the Rhine and push the Germans back, but was preparing instead to march for Constantinople. Every one of his friends and advisors begged him to stay, to not abandon Gaul right now at this critical hour, and to stay until the Alemanni were driven off. After all, it was his duty as emperor to be here for his people. But Valentinian was far more concerned about the other piece of news he received, supposedly, on that same day. One of Julian's maternal cousins, a man named Procopius, had seized control of Constantinople and had had himself declared Augustus. No one knew if Valens was alive or dead. No one really knew what the situation was, so Valentinian was determined to head east and deal with the usurper head on. But hot on the heels of the initial reports were further reports that Valens was alive and had been marching towards Syria at the head of an army when Procopius seized Constantinople. So after another round of badgering from his friends and advisors, Valentinian reluctantly decided to remain in the west and deal with the Alemanni threat, and leave Procopius to his brother. The emperor would later say that because the Germans were a threat to the empire, while Procopius was merely a threat to his own family, that he had no choice but to stay and see to the safety of Gaul. Which meant that Procopius was now Valens's problem, and Valens's problem alone. It would be his first test not just as an emperor, but as a military commander, and though things started out a bit rough, I think in the end he acquitted himself nicely. After parting with his brother, Valens had returned to Constantinople, where he spent the next year or so getting to know his half of the empire. Though things on the eastern border with Persia were relatively quiet for the moment, it was obvious to everyone that it wasn't going to stay like that forever. As 364 gave way to 365, more and more reports began to filter in about the movement and machinations of Shapur. The Sassanid king had apparently decided that driving the Romans out of Persia with their tails tucked between their legs meant that he now pretty much had a free hand to do whatever he wanted. So, he started doing whatever he wanted. First, he moved his forces into Mesopotamia, a territory which, so far as anyone can tell, was well outside the purview of any agreement he had signed with Jovian. Then he went further and moved into Armenia and deposed its pro-Roman king. This was practically a declaration of war. The deal had been for Armenian neutrality, not for Armenia to be occupied by the Sassanids. Shapur II is kind of a hard guy to figure. One minute, he's readily agreeing to treaties so he doesn't have to fight a pitched battle with the Romans, and the next, he's running around more or less forcing them to come back to fight him. It's like he was never quite sure exactly how strong he really was. Sometimes he was like, yeah, bring it on. and other times he was like, whoa, let's not do something we're going to regret here. These alternating postures were generally linked to the proximity of a hostile Roman army. So maybe Shapur isn't that hard of a guy to figure out after all. With the Sassanids busy snatching up a mile for the inch that they had been given, Valens had no choice but to head to Syria and respond. He gathered back up all the forces that had accompanied first Jovian and then Valentinian to Constantinople, and led them back east toward Antioch in the autumn of 365. He had made it as far as Cilicia when he got the news. A relative of Julian's named Procopius had induced 2 legions to declare him Augustus and had seized Constantinople. Okay, so I guess I'm dealing with that then. The natural question to ask at this point is, who the hell is Procopius? Well, Procopius was one of the maternal cousins of Julian the Apostate, and thus one of the last men left with any kind of connection to the now otherwise extinct Constantinian dynasty. He had been a trusted advisor during Julian's brief reign, and had actually been the man who led the decoy army that had distracted Shapur during Julian's invasion of Persia. This meant that he had not been there when his cousin died. Had Procopius been there, his familial connection might have led the officers to select him instead of Jovian, but that is merely a possibility, because Procopius was not exactly a beloved man in the ranks. For example, the fact that he was not with the main army when Julian died was a cause of much irritation within the senior staff, who wound up feeling like the whole debacle could have been avoided had Procopius pushed harder to link up with the rest of the army instead of taking his sweet time marching south and leaving Julian unreinforced. But whether Procopius would have been chosen is neither here nor there, because he wasn't. And when the decoy army finally did link up with the main army, Jovian was emperor and the Romans were in retreat. We have conflicting accounts of what happened next. According to Zosimus, Procopius met with Jovian and asked permission to retire to public life, a request that Jovian granted. According to Marcellinus, though, the minute Procopius heard Jovian was in charge, he went into hiding, fearing that his connection to Julian would lead Jovian to see him as a threat. Either way, when Jovian died 8 months later, Procopius was out of the public eye and likely living somewhere near Cappadocia. Though there is some ambiguity about the attitude of Jovian towards Procopius, there is no ambiguity about the attitude of Valentinian and Valens towards Procopius. They didn't like him or his connection to the Constantinian dynasty one bit. So, shortly after becoming co-emperor, Valens ordered some agents to go track down Julian's cousin and arrest him. Procopius managed to give his would-be captors the slip, and for the next year or so, he fell completely off the radar. Then he showed up in Constantinople in September of 365, and suddenly was on everyone's radar. Procopius had apparently decided while he was in hiding that his best chance of survival was to go big. Eventually, he was going to be betrayed into Valens' hands, so why not take a shot at cutting off those hands before they could get to him? Opportunity knocked when Procopius learned how dissatisfied the people of Constantinople were with Petronius, the emperor's father-in-law, and the man Valens had left in charge of the city when he had gone east. Apparently, Petronius was one of those his cruelty is matched only by his greed types. So, with the emperor's representative thoroughly unpopular, and the emperor himself moving further away by the day, Procopius figured that now was his best chance at pulling off a coup. So he snuck into Constantinople and began feeling out possible conspirators. He had the good fortune to stumble upon 2 legions passing through the capital, who just so happened to have been loyal to the Constantinians in general, and Julian in particular. With the usual promises of great reward, the men of these legions pledged themselves to Julian's cousin, hailed him as Augustus, and helped him seize control of the imperial palace. I haven't been able to nail down Petronius's fate, but I would guess that if he didn't escape, then he was put to death. At first, the citizens of Constantinople seemed more bemused by Procopius's coup than anything else. But the would-be emperor was a savvy operator, and launched a concerted propaganda campaign to win their support. First, he paid a few incoming travelers from the west to tell anyone who would listen that Valentinian had actually died. So it's not like I'm usurping anyone here. Then he issued coins highlighting his ties to the house of Constantine, and made sure that he was accompanied in public by Constantius II's widow Faustina and the dead emperor's young daughter Constantina. Then came the coup de grace. Procopius began telling people that on the eve of the Eastern invasion, that Julian had told him that should anything happen, that he wanted Procopius to rise in his place. Luckily, there were no witnesses to this momentous pronouncement. The people of Constantinople were thus ensnared by a web of disinformation and sentimentality, and came to support Procopius, because it seemed like, well, if Valentinian's dead, someone has to rule, and we may as well go back to someone from Constantine's royal family. Except, yeah, Valentinian wasn't dead, and neither was Valens. The Western Augustus, as I already mentioned, was all set to march east until he was talked out of it by his advisors. Meanwhile, Valens was at first unsure of what to do. He had only been in office for a year, had no real legitimacy of his own besides the fact that he was Valentinian's brother, and here a member of the old imperial family had seized control of the capital. His thoughts turned first to the merits of abdication and suicide. But after passing through this dark night of the soul, Valens, prompted by supportive officers, resolved to fight for his throne. But he had a problem. He didn't really have much of anyone available to fight with. When he got the news of Procopius's revolt, he was at a port in Cilicia, having just watched most of his army set sail for Syria. He was supposed to follow himself with the last few ships, but now, well, now what should he do? Time was of the essence, so Valens turned around and headed back to Constantinople, sending 2 crack units ahead to try to take back the city. But this force was not nearly strong enough to get the job done, and when they arrived, Procopius simply talked them into coming over to his side. When Valens himself arrived on the east side of the Bosphorus with his small army and began operations to re-secure the strait, he was driven off and nearly captured by the surprisingly stiff resistance of Procopius's men. With a light and quick retaking of Constantinople now out of the question, Valens withdrew back to Ancyra to wait for reinforcements so he could play the old massively superior forces card. The fortunes of Procopius peaked around New Year's, when, through hook, crook, and a few well-placed bribes, he found himself controlling the neighboring provinces of Thrace and Bithynia, in addition to the territory immediately surrounding Constantinople. But that was the high water mark. He made a play at seizing control of Illyria, which would have been a huge boon to his cause, but Procopius's agents were stopped dead in their tracks by Aquitius, the general who had been a candidate himself for the imperial throne, before the court officials had settled on Valentinian. Stalled out, Procopius now found himself with a lot of outstanding promises to cover, without really having any means to pay for it all. So he began focusing all his attention on rounding up wealthy men to help finance his little revolution, rather than focusing on the small matter of the now large army Valens had gathered up in Ancyra. When the spring came, Valens descended into Phrygia, with the intention of approaching Constantinople from the south. Procopius ordered his best general to meet them, but at the ensuing Battle of Thyatira, Procopius's general was soundly defeated. The army of Valens then moved north, where they tracked down and confronted Julian's cousin directly. I imagine at this point that Procopius was getting ready to make a last stand, go down fighting in a blaze of glory, and all that. But his men didn't give him a chance. When Valens' army arrived, a few of the officers under Procopius's command did some quick math, realized they were probably doomed, and put Procopius in chains. After he was handed over to Valens, the would-be emperor was immediately beheaded on May the 27th, 366 AD, about 8 months after the initial coup. Though Procopius himself was now dead, his family's fortunes were not doomed forever, and one of his descendants, another Procopius, would become a prominent enough general that in the mid-400s, his son Anthemius will be placed on the Western throne. But I'm sure that was of small comfort to our now headless Procopius. So Valens survived his first real test in power, only moderately worse for the wear. He had lost a year in his dealings with Shapur, but in the process, he had firmly cemented his own legitimacy. His victory over Procopius meant that the Constantinians were out and the Valentinians were in. Back in the West, I'm sure that Valentinian, who was probably nervous about his brother's chances, received this news with a great deal of satisfaction. On top of the fact that his brother was still alive, and his brother's grip on power was now stronger than ever, it was probably nice for Valentinian just to receive any good news at all. Because since that fateful November the 1st, things had not gone well for the Western Emperor at all. At first, Valentinian had tried to deal with the Alemanni invasion by sending a couple of armies out under subordinate commanders, but both had not only failed to contain the Germans, but they had gotten themselves killed in the process. So in the spring of 365, as Valens was marching on Procopius, Valentinian sent out another army, this one headed by his master of the horse. But while this army had not gotten beat, and the master of the horse had not gotten dead, they had proved themselves to be incapable of putting the Germans away. By the time Valentinian received Procopius's head in a box, with Valens' compliments of course, he was getting ready to sack his master of the horse and replace him with yet another commander, this time a man named Jovinus, no relation to the dead emperor. With Jovinus in charge, things finally started to go right. The field commander was able to report back that with the winter approaching, the Alemanni were fleeing back across the Rhine. Valentinian's fury over this whole situation had been frustrated by the fact that he had been unable to make any headway against the Germans. Now that they were back across the Rhine, his anger could really be unleashed. He spent the winter of 367-368 gathering a massive army that he planned to send across the Rhine the following spring to pay the Alemanni back tenfold for what they had done. But just as he was gearing up for what was sure to be a cathartic burn, pillage, and murder campaign through Germany, word came down from the north that something big had just happened. Something coordinated. Something overwhelming. What was that something? What could be so important as to draw Valentinian away from his beloved punitive expedition? Could it have anything to do with the slipping imperial grip on the island of Britain? Find out next week on another exciting episode of The History of Rome, when we get our first look at one of the most famous of all the late antiquity German confederations, those damned marauding pirates, the Saxons. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 149, The Great Conspiracy. Last time, we focused mostly on the brief revolt of Procopius, the last man to wave Constantine's banner. After his defeat in May of 365, the torrent of history would blindly rush on, and the combined Valentinian-Theodosian dynasty would supplant the Constantinian dynasty as the ruling family of the Roman Empire. With Valens now secure on the throne in the east, this week I want to focus on Valentinian's problems in the west, of which there were two main centers of action. The first was the ongoing and frustrating campaign against the Alemanni on the Upper Rhine, and the second was the short-lived but very nearly catastrophic war on the island of Britain. Valentinian thought that he was only going to have to deal with the former, but in the winter of 367, completely out of nowhere, the northernmost reaches of the empire were overwhelmed all at once by old adversaries like the Picts and the Franks, and new adversaries like the Saxons. The simultaneous assault was clearly a coordinated effort between these otherwise disparate tribes, and it took the northern Roman command completely by surprise. Though for a time the barbarians held the initiative and control of Britain was suddenly in doubt, the main upshot of the war was that it brought the Theodosians to the forefront of imperial politics and paved the way for their entry into the ruling dynasty. The trouble in Britain likely began as a result of simple neglect. The last time the island was really a top-level priority was way back when, prior to the creation of the Tetrarchy, when Carausius revolted. Constantine later paid a decent amount of attention to the island because of his own personal ties to the province, but once he was gone, his sons essentially left the Britons to their own devices. So for a generation at least, a sort of decaying inertia took over. The Roman administration had become one part lazy and one part corrupt. The Roman soldiers were far removed from the main action of the 4th century, and so had no access to the kind of bonuses and donatives enjoyed by other legions. The local citizens were just sort of going through the motions, too Romanized to be considered wild natives, but not Romanized enough to really love the imperial bureaucrats who ruled them. And finally, trade across the English Channel, the lifeblood of the Romano-British economy, was frequently disrupted by opportunistic Franks or Saxons, a new confederation that we'll get to in a second. The whole thing had just become stagnant, unhappy, and unprofitable. Unfortunately for us, really good details about who started talking to who, when, and why are lacking in the historical record. But it appears that a few of the leaders from a few of the different tribes surrounding Britannia looked at the state of the province and saw a golden opportunity. The barbarian leaders calculated that with the imperial apparatus as atrophied as it was, if it was hit from multiple sides all at once, the chances of it cracking completely were likely pretty high. Then it would just be a matter of marching around and picking up whatever you wanted and carting it home. This sounded like a pretty good idea to a lot of different people, and so using whatever channels they used to communicate, the Picts up in Caledonia, some tribes from over on Hibernia, Ireland, to you and me, the Franks down on the northern continental coast, and the Saxons from over near the Jutland, agreed to simultaneously invade Britannia. The assumption was that the Romans would not at all be prepared for that kind of coordinated offensive, and, even though assumptions usually make an ass out of you and me, this time the assumption was spot on. The Romans were not at all prepared for that kind of coordinated assault. But before we get into the guts of this thing, I do want to formally introduce the Saxons. Though in the end they are a comparatively minor player in the history of Rome, in the history of the world they are a pretty big deal, as they formed a key part of the German migration that swept into Britain following the collapse of the empire, helping to establish the foundations of modern Anglo-Saxon Britain in the process. In the 300s AD, though, they were little more than a loose collection of German tribesmen who lived at the base of the Jutland, the Danish peninsula that sticks out of the top of mainland Europe like a little periscope. Much less organized than the Franks or the Alemanni, scholars are none too confident about what exactly makes a Saxon at this point in history. But references to pirate bands bearing that name begin to pop up during Julian's Gallic campaign, and it is clear that some group identified as Saxon played a major role in the barbarian conspiracy that we're about to dive into. On a side note, it is possible that it was primarily Saxon piracy that led the Romans to develop the so-called Saxon Shore military district, which was a string of military forts on the southern coast of Britain unified under a single command. That said, some have argued that the network was actually set up by Carausius during his revolt to defend the island against Maximian and Constantius, and others have argued that the term Saxon Shore actually refers to the fact that the area was heavily settled by the Saxons, not because these forts were designed to repel them. Either way, the fortification network was likely up and running as a single command at this point in our story, and they were absolutely, completely, and totally ineffective. I have seen it reported in a number of different places that the coordinated invasion of Britannia began when the Picts bribed the garrison guarding Hadrian's Wall to let them pass. But I can't figure out exactly where this detail is coming from, since neither Zosimus nor Marcellinus mentions it. It is certainly a plausible detail, since both historians explicitly state that deserting soldiers were as big a problem as foreign barbarians during the next year, and I can definitely see members of the Hadrian's Wall garrison, having now committed some light treason, simply abandoning their posts after letting the Picts through. But I can't nail down a source for this fun little nugget, and so I don't want to say that this is how it happened. If anyone knows where this is coming from, though, by all means, drop me a line. Because all I have in the way of detail right now is that in early 367, Britannia was overwhelmed from all sides by barbarian raiders. And so, that's as far as I'm willing to go right now. Once the barbarians were inside the province, though, there is no confusion about how things went from there. Hit by surprise from all sides, the Roman defenses crumbled. The commander of the Saxon Shore military district was killed when the first wave of Franks and Saxons hit the southeast coastline. The Picts who poured down from Caledonia and the tribesmen who crossed over from Hibernia met no real resistance, and everywhere Roman garrisons were put to flight. Most of the cities of the province were unable to fend off the invaders and were easily sacked, creating a wave of refugees, runaway slaves, and deserted soldiers, all roaming the countryside seeking safety, freedom, or plunder. The leading imperial officials left on the island gathered what forces they could in the southeast corner of the island, where they holed up in a few of the larger cities. Outside of these few urban holdouts, though, anarchy reigned across the island, as roving bands of varying size and purpose wandered around plundering, raping, and killing whatever struck their fancy. Had there been any sort of larger purpose to the invasion, or any sort of coordinated political agenda to go along with the initial coordinated attack, this might have spelled the end for the Romans in Britain. After all, trade lines to the island had become harder and harder to protect over the years, and with the empire facing huge problems elsewhere, the province of Britannia, like Dacia before it, might have become a casualty of prioritization. But it appears that there was no larger purpose to the invasion. Not only were the various tribes not at all united politically, none of them appeared to even have a political agenda of their own. This was not a war of liberation for the Picts, or a war of conquest for the Franks. This was plundering for plundering's sake. And so the Romans were eventually able to reassert control over the island and hold on to it for at least a little while longer. However, in less than 50 years, the Romans will indeed withdraw from Britain for good, leaving the island to King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. Events up in the north unfolded so rapidly that Valentinian was essentially presented with a large-scale fait accompli. Not, the barbarians are attacking our forts in Britannia. Not, we are losing ground. Not, oh, we've lost control of some territory. But rather, Britannia is completely overrun. We are trapped behind the walls of like 3 cities and probably aren't going to be able to hold out much longer. You'll recall from last week that Valentinian was in the middle of organizing an invasion of his own. But when the first reports started filtering down from the north, he was forced to break off what he was doing and turn his attention to the problem of Britannia. Well, at least break off some of the forces he was gathering and turn their attention to the problem of Britannia. As he had shown in his dealings with the Alemanni, Valentinian's MO early in his reign appears to have been to send subordinate commanders to actually lead the Roman field armies into dicey situations. In preparation for future episodes, I've been reading up on Theodosius lately, and I think something that someone mentioned about Theodosius's military political strategy during the Gothic War applies to Valentinian as well. Namely, that since military defeat would have been a crushing blow to the emperor's legitimacy if he was actually there in person, there emerged a tendency to let subordinates actually fight the battles. Victories could be easily claimed by the emperors, as was the accepted custom, but defeats could be fobbed off on the losing general. In a chaotic and dangerous time, this strategy was not merely in the best interests of the emperor personally, but it was in the best interests of the empire as a whole. Stability at the top of the political pyramid has real value. By not risking defeat, the emperors ensured that there would be no crisis of political legitimacy to go along with some crisis of military defeat. As we will soon see, this strategy was not as completely entrenched as it would become during the Byzantine era, but it was working its way into the imperial fabric. As when the Alemanni crossed the Rhine in 365, it took a little while for Valentinian to find a commander whose victory he could take credit for in Britain, rather than a commander whose defeat he needed to distance himself from. Responding immediately to the calls for help, Valentinian dispatched an officer named Severus, who had distinguished himself already as one of the generals who couldn't push back the Alemanni in the winter of 365-366. The hope, I suppose, is that this would be an easier job and not require the same degree of, no, it was a hard job. And Severus once again failed to get any kind of coherent relief effort going. So, likely in the spring of 367, Valentinian upped the ante and dispatched Jovinus, the general who had eventually gotten the better of the Alemanni the year before. But he too floundered in his attempt to get a foothold on the anarchic island. We don't have many details, but all of 367 AD appears to have been dogged by repeated failures and embarrassments for the Romans. Hoping that the third time would be the charm, in the spring of 368, Valentinian sent off a much larger relief army under the command of a highly regarded veteran officer named Theodosius. No, not that Theodosius. That Theodosius's father. Not much is known about the elder Theodosius, but we do know that he and his family hailed from Spain, and that like most of the Christians in Hispania, he was a staunch supporter of the Nicene Creed. He was married around 340, and in either 346 or 347, his wife gave birth to the future Emperor Theodosius. Though, of course, it would be over 30 years before anyone realized that the younger Theodosius had in fact been future Emperor Theodosius the whole time. The elder Theodosius probably joined the army at some point in his late teens or early 20s, and displayed enough talent to earn promotion after promotion. By the time the Roman response to the barbarian invasion of Britain was proving to be completely ineffective, Theodosius was in his mid-40s and ready to make the leap into the big time. So as I just said, in the spring of 368, Valentinian tapped Theodosius to lead another, larger relief army north to secure the troubled province of Britannia. It was the kind of assignment that could make or break a career, and Theodosius took his job seriously. He was not heading north just to knock a few heads around. He was also interested in making sure this sort of thing didn't happen again. The relief army sailed from Boulogne and landed without incident on the southeast tip of Britain, and then marched up the Thames to Londinium. Establishing a secure base in that city, Theodosius then set about methodically retaking the island. Working in his favor was the fact that after a year of successful plundering, the various raiding parties had become lax with their guard and were weighed down by all their captured treasure. So when Theodosius split his army up into small groups and ordered them to scour the countryside looking for enemy raiders, these raiders were now easily captured. Once the immediate area around Londinium was cleared, Theodosius used intelligence gleaned from his prisoners to extend these operations to the whole island. Relying on small mobile detachments rather than a large field army, the Romans were able to travel light, travel fast, and surprise enemy bands anytime their whereabouts became known. Pretty soon, the tide had turned in Rome's favor, allowing Theodosius to pull a completely different rabbit out of his hat. While lawlessness reigned, Roman soldiers who had deserted their posts had no incentive to abandon their own plundering and return to the army. All that would be waiting for them was execution. Desertion, after all, was a capital crime. But now that Theodosius was making headway, these soldiers began to worry about what might happen to them if they were captured. So, when things started going well, Theodosius alleviated these fears and announced a general amnesty for AWOL soldiers. With the party pretty clearly winding down anyway, the AWOL soldiers flocked back to their bases, which had the dual effect of reducing the number of pillagers in the field and increasing the number of troops in the Roman army. With that stroke of lenient genius, the ballgame was pretty much over. Over the course of 368 and into 369, Theodosius was able to re-garrison all the cities of Britain and drive off whatever barbarians remained on the island. Most of the wealth that had been seized was recovered, and though Theodosius was careful to make sure the majority of it went back to the original owners, he was also careful to make sure that some of it was directed to his soldiers, who had done the dangerous work of actually getting it back. By the end of 369, Britannia was at peace. Theodosius was a bona fide hero, and Valentinian had a victory that he could finally take credit for. Happy days for everyone. Though the war in Britain had stalled Valentinian's plans for a punitive expedition into Alemanni territory in 367, that by no means meant that the expedition was going to be put off for good. But that said, the emperor did come perilously close to never being able to actually lead this campaign, because in the summer of 367, he got sick. Really, really sick. So sick that there was genuine fear that he was going to die. With these fears haunting the imperial court, factions began to form around the top military and civilian officials, who naturally began to jockey for position. Should Valentinian die, everyone wanted to make sure that their man was the man picked to succeed him. When the emperor recovered, though, he found out about all of this morbid maneuvering and decided to put a stop to all questions of succession once and for all. In August of 367 AD, he elevated his 8-year-old son not to the rank of Caesar, but to the full rank of Augustus, and began to make a concerted effort to give the boy the skills he would need to survive in the dangerous world of imperial politics. Meanwhile, the Alemanni were getting restless. Since they had been driven back home, they had been waiting nervously for the counter-invasion everyone knew was coming, But then the counter-invasion just sort of didn't happen. Between the war in Britain and the emperor's illness, the Romans had stayed put on their side of the Rhine, and so the Alemanni poked their heads up and decided to see what the deal was. By the end of 367, the Germans decided that the coast might actually be clear, and so they up and sacked the fortified city of Mainz. Valentinian's blood had to be boiling at this point, but there was little he could do about it just yet. He did, however, manage to exact a small measure of vengeance by arranging for the assassination of one of the leading anti-Roman Alemanni kings. That was at least something. In the spring of 368, Valentinian was finally ready to do a whole lot more. Probably right around the time Theodosius was setting off for Britain, the emperor personally led the Rhine legions across the river to pay the Alemanni back for all the trouble they had caused him. This time, he would not be delegating the job to subordinates. Like I said, the policy of utilizing subordinate generals to do the actual fighting was not completely entrenched yet. And besides, this was supposed to be a stomp and mash campaign against a weakened opponent, not a by-the-skin-of-the-teeth attempt to turn back an enemy who had momentum. But though it started out as the bloody walk in the park it was supposed to be, it quickly turned into one of those by-the-skin-of-their-teeth campaigns that very nearly cost Valentinian not just his throne, but his life. With his son Gratian along for the ride, things started out well for the Romans. The Alemanni were quick to run and hide whenever the legions came near, and Valentinian seized or burned whatever the Germans left behind. So far, so good. This'll teach him to mess with us, etc., etc. But then suddenly, a little bit south of the modern city of Heidelberg, the Alemanni grouped for a massive counterattack. We know almost nothing about the ensuing battle, except that it was a huge affair, closely contested until the very end, and that in the midst of the chaos, Valentinian was very nearly killed in the fighting. The Romans emerged from the battle victorious, but the emperor determined that they were too weak to continue the campaign. With both sides exhausted, a temporary truce was agreed to, and Valentinian withdrew to Trier to recuperate and plan his next move. Far from pursuing a policy of peaceful coexistence, though, Valentinian's next move would all but guarantee that as soon as everyone's wounds were healed up, that the fighting would begin all over again. Before we go this week, I'd like to take a second to revise and extend my remarks about Valentinian's early career. The whole period is a mess of confused chronology and conflicting details, and I inadvertently missed a whole alternate version of Valentinian's pre-imperial service. This version is based primarily on Ammianus Marcellinus's account, which states that Valentinian was not promoted into Constantius's army around 360 AD, but rather that he was discharged from the service in 357 after being falsely accused of cowardice. Cowardice? Really? Yes, really. Remember that band of Germans that Barbatio had failed to stop while Julian was campaigning in Gaul? Well, he pinned all of that on two of his tribunes, one of whom turned out to be Valentinian. This version of history thus implies that the future emperor did not in fact fight at the Battle of Strasbourg, like I said he likely did. Beyond this, Walter Roberts of Emory University argues that Valentinian was not recalled to the army by his old general Julian at all, and that the future emperor was only reinstated to service after Jovian was in power. According to this version, Valentinian was then assigned to the somewhat dangerous mission of telling the troops of the Western Empire that their beloved Julian was dead. It was in gratitude for this service that Jovian promoted Valentinian to his fateful post in Ancyra. From there, I think we got back on firmer footing. These are minor details in the big picture, but if it's true, then this version does undercut some of what I said about Julian not caring that his officers were Christian so long as they were good at their jobs. I think the point still stands, but Valentinian may not have been the best example to use. Okay, next week we'll dive more into the now perpetually chaotic western half of the empire. War with the Germans would continue as a result of Valentinian's provocations, and one Alemanni king in particular will wind up driving the emperor absolutely crazy. Meanwhile, Africa will go to hell in a handbasket after years of misrule, and poor Theodosius the Elder, after proving himself to be one of the most capable officers in the army, will be executed following the sneaky dealings of sneaky courtiers. Like everything else during these years, events are badly dated, and who was doing what when is a difficult thing to nail down. I'm going to do my best to wade through the mess, but I reserve the right to revise and extend my remarks as circumstances dictate. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 150, The Perils of Mismanagement. In the winter of 368 AD, Valentinian was in the northern capital of Trier, making plans to overhaul the fortifications of the Rhine frontier. The whole region had been a disrupted mess since the revolt of Magnentius back in 350, and though Julian had done much to restore order, since the apostate emperor had gone east to meet his destiny, the west had slipped back into chaos. This was partly due to the increasing entropy of the time, but it was also due to Valentinian's own mishandling of the situation. Now that things in Britannia were back in hand and the Alemanni had been defeated in battle, the emperor was of a mind that it was time to re-cement Roman power. The only problem was that Valentinian's plan was so aggressive that it had the exact opposite effect. When the spring of 369 arrived, Valentinian ordered his troops to begin repairing and rebuilding various forts along the Roman side of the Rhine, which, so far, so good. But then the emperor took the provocative step of ordering his men to build a fort on the far side of the river, near the spot where the Romans and Alemanni had fought the year before, just south of the modern city of Heidelberg. Envoys from the Alemanni immediately protested the existence of a permanent Roman base in their territory, and they asked for an audience with Valentinian. But, as was the emperor's apparent custom, this request was denied. Once again, the Alemanni left the imperial court furious and hot for blood. Where there had just been a tentative peace, there was now once again a pretext for war. The new leader of the Alemanni, a wily king named Macrianus, quickly organized a strike force that began attacking the soldiers working on the offending base until the Romans were driven off and the half-built fort was destroyed. This, of course, ticked Valentinian off something fierce, but after his near-death experience at the end of 368, he was wary of just up and invading Alemanni territory again, at least not without stacking the deck a little. So in 370, he presented a plan to the Burgundians, another German confederation who lived a little bit deeper into the interior of Germania. They were already enemies of the Alemanni, and so Valentinian suggested that they just do what he knew they wanted to do, which was go on the offensive against their neighbors. Valentinian promised to support the effort, and implied that once battle was joined, that the Romans would cross over and attack the Alemanni from the rear. But though the supplies were promised, the whole bit about joining in the fight was merely implied. When the Burgundian envoys pressed for a guarantee, the Romans were reluctant to provide it. So the Burgundians asked for an audience with Valentinian. but as was now standard operating procedure, they were refused. Annoyed by this rebuke, and without much to go on but the manipulative prodding of the Romans, the Burgundians returned home, declining to raise a hand against the Alemanni. But the talks did turn out to stack the deck just a little in Rome's favor. When the Alemanni caught wind of a possible Roman-Burgundian alliance, they decided the most prudent response would be to scatter. When Valentinian heard that the Alemanni forces were decentralized, he immediately prepared for another invasion. This one to be led by the emperor's newly minted master of the horse and all-around Mr. Fix-It, Theodosius the Elder. Theodosius had come back from Britannia at the end of 369 and was now clearly the one man Valentinian had confidence in, a confidence that he would prove himself worthy of over and over again. At some point in 371 or 372, Theodosius gathered up an army in the province of Raetia, and then crossed over into Alemanni territory. With no one part of the scattered German confederation large enough to fend off the Roman advance, Theodosius was able to sweep through the territory, rounding up hordes of prisoners in the process. These prisoners were then deposited in the Po Valley of northern Italy, where, in return for their lives, they were to become settled farmers and willing recruits for the Roman army. In the midst of this campaign, Theodosius nearly captured Macrianus, but the Alemanni king managed to slip away. But that did not stop Theodosius from imposing a new order on the Germans. A pro-Roman chieftain was raised up, and the other Alemanni nobles were forced to submit to his supremacy. It was a top-down imposition of authority that would wind up holding no real force once the Romans withdrew, but it was some nice wrapping paper around a very successful campaign season for Theodosius. Though this would not be the end of the wars against the Alemanni, this was enough of a settlement for Valentinian that the emperor thought it safe to transfer his Mr. Fix-It down to North Africa, which had suddenly become the new crisis center of the Western Empire. Apparently, some kind of revolt had broken out, and there were conflicting reports coming in about what was really going on, who was fighting for what, and who was to blame. At the center of the maelstrom was Romanus, the dukes of the North African legions, who is unquestionably the villain of this story. Romanus was exactly the sort of greedy nihilist that you just really want in a high-ranking position of authority in a territory that you are just barely holding on to. He was a disaster. Without him around, I doubt any of what's about to happen would have happened. Above and beyond the petty corruption that usually accumulates around ethically challenged leaders, Romanus had developed a truly sinister means of enriching himself. Once the various municipalities of North Africa had paid all their taxes and sent along all the required conscripts to fill the ranks of the army, Romanus would go around and ask for more money, and more men. If the municipalities balked, then Romanus would hint darkly that, should Moorish raiders attack your city, my men might be too occupied to come help you. But if you pay up, then I'll make sure we come running. Most of the cities gave in to this blackmail, but there were a few who refused. And this is where things get ugly. You see, Romanus wasn't bluffing. He used his contacts with various Moor tribes to hint to them that if they were planning on attacking such and such a city, that it was highly likely the legions would be occupied elsewhere and not make it in time to stop them. The Moors, given the green light, would then come down out of the hills and sack the city. Romanus would not lift a finger to help. The Dukes of North Africa then was not just corrupt or negligent, he was ordering attacks on the very people he was supposed to be protecting. The citizens of Africa naturally began to complain to the emperor, but refusing to be anything but just a terrible, terrible guy, Romanus used his connections in the imperial court to pin all of his crimes on innocent subordinates. Misled about the situation, Valentinian ordered the execution of a handful of officials who, besides having nothing at all to do with Romanus's crimes, had probably tried to stop him, which is why Romanus had singled him out for framing. In 372, this all finally became too much for a Romano-Moorish noble named Firmus. Firmus was the son of a half-Moor, half-Roman leader whose family played a dual role in Roman Africa. On the one hand, they served as high-ranking officials in the imperial bureaucracy, and on the other hand, they served as the leaders of a local Moorish tribe. Romanus was offensive to both halves of Firmus's identity, and with the emperor successfully hoodwinked into supporting the evil dukes, Firmus decided to take matters into his own hand. Backed by the legionary forces under his command, Firmus raised the standard of revolt and called for the people to join his cause. The uprising came as something of a surprise up in Trier, where Valentinian was now more or less permanently based, because, after all, hadn't he taken care of this problem? Hadn't he just executed a bunch of guys? Why was there now suddenly a revolt? To answer these questions, Valentinian dispatched Theodosius to investigate. There was speculation that the emperor was already at this point pretty sure that he had been lied to, and that Theodosius was being sent down to Africa as much to deal with the problem of Romanus as he was to deal with the revolt of Firmus. We don't know when exactly Theodosius arrived in Africa, other than that it was sometime between 372 and 375, which isn't very satisfying, but we do know that when he got there, he was able to quickly establish that Romanus was guilty as sin, and the dukes was arrested. With Romanus taken care of, Firmus lost his casus belli, and so immediately attempted a reconciliation with Theodosius and the rest of the Roman authorities. But Theodosius was not going to let him off that easy. Justified or not, Firmus had led Roman citizens into revolt against the lawful government. That was a crime that could not go unpunished, so Theodosius rejected Firmus's request for a peace. I can see where Theodosius is coming from. We can't negotiate with usurpers and all that. But by refusing to bring Firmus down from the hills, Theodosius set up the African provinces for years of bloody and ultimately pointless struggle. The master of the horse launched a military campaign to bring Firmus to heel by force, which divided the citizens of the provinces from each other and led to bloody reprisals, as cities were caught supporting this side or that at the wrong time. Underlying the war was the fact that Firmus was a Donatist Christian, and Theodosius was a staunch Nicene. So the two sides began to break down along the same religious lines that had been dividing the Africans for years. So all in all, it was a bad time to be a North African. And, as was happening up in Britannia, the bonds that tied the locals to the empire and vice versa were beginning to fray dangerously. Eventually, Firmus was brought down the same way that Jugurtha had been brought down 500 years before. Another Moorish chief looking to get into Theodosius's good books lured Firmus into a trap under false pretenses and captured him. But unlike Jugurtha, Firmus was able to escape the humiliation of being presented to the Romans in chains, and he committed suicide before he could be handed over. As I just said, although Theodosius was technically successful in his mission, Romanus was out of the picture, and Firmus had been taken down without having to compromise with him. The net result of it all was that the Roman hold over North Africa was further eroded. As with Britain, in about 50 years, Roman rule in North Africa will enter its death spiral, and though Justinian will be able to briefly reassert control over the region at disastrous cost, the end of the Western Empire clearly was nigh. While Theodosius was quelling the revolt in Africa, Valentinian struggled to deal with the continued intransigence of the Alemanni, while also dealing with yet another hotspot lit on fire by Roman mismanagement, this one flaring up along the Danube. Failing to learn his lesson from what had just happened with the Alemanni, in 373, Valentinian ordered forward bases built across the Danube in the territory of the Quadi. Like the Alemanni, the Quadi were annoyed when they found out that forts were being built in their lands, and so sent representatives to bargain with Equitius, who was still in charge of military operations in Illyria. But Equitius, taking his cues from Valentinian, refused to meet with the representatives when they arrived. We don't know exactly what happened next, that is, whether the Quadi began to actively hinder the building projects like the Alemanni had, or if they just kept up their complaining, but for one reason or another, construction of the forts began to fall behind schedule. In response, the Praetorian prefect of Gaul, who had the emperor's ear because Valentinian was based in Trier, had his son Marcellianus assigned to the project with a mandate to get it back on track. Marcellianus packed his bags and made sure to bring his jug of gasoline and strike anywhere matches. When the new foreman arrived, he did all the normal things you do when a project is stalled out. He cracked the whip and demanded results and not excuses. As he was attempting to turn things around, though, he quickly learned that the Quadi were still refusing to just roll over and accept the new forts, and they peppered him constantly with complaints and petitions and demands, anything to get the Romans to knock it off. All of this came to greatly annoy Marcellianus, and so he decided to send the Quadi a message. He invited the leadership of the tribe to a Roman-sponsored peace banquet, and then, when everyone was good and lubricated, he seized the most powerful Quadi king and had him executed. Marcellianus was under the impression that this would cow the Germans into submission. Instead, as I'm sure any objective observer could have predicted, Marcellianus's treachery sparked a war. When the Quadi found out what had happened, they got together with some allied Sarmatians and launched a full-scale attack on the Romans' forward position on the north side of the Danube. Taken completely off guard because he was under the impression that his sneaky murder had been so super intimidating, Marcellianus and his men were forced to pull up stakes and make a run for it. When they got back across the Danube, they sat down to catch their breath, but then looked up and realized that the Quadi and Sarmatians were not stopping. So Marcellianus and his men kept running south. The barbarian force crossed the Danube and kept up the pursuit, burning and pillaging anything they came across. The Roman alarm was quickly raised, and 2 legions were sent to intercept the invaders, but just to compound an already disastrous situation, the commanders of the 2 legions didn't get along with each other. They failed to cooperate, and so the Quadi-Sarmatian army was able to continue their marauding unchecked, now less interested in revenging themselves upon Marcellianus and more interested in just plundering. While Illyria burned, another branch of the Sarmatians decided to join in the fun and crossed over the Danube into Moesia. But unlike the Roman response in Illyria, which was a delicious mix of cowardice and internal bickering, the Roman response in Moesia was smart, prompt, and effective. Mostly because the Dukes of Moesia was an able young commander named Theodosius. Yes, that Theodosius. With the Danube under attack and North Africa still a mess, Valentinian was forced to do something that he really didn't want to do. Make peace with the Alemanni. And not just the Alemanni in general, but Macrianus in particular. Since Valentinian had assassinated his predecessor, Macrianus had emerged as the leading anti-Roman chief in the German ranks. He had orchestrated the attack on the Heidelberg fort, and then kept up the resistance, even as Theodosius won engagement after engagement. Technically, he had then been deposed, but as soon as Theodosius withdrew, the Alemanni began agitating against their new puppet king and pledging their allegiance once again to Macrianus. Unable to spare the men or the manpower to head back into German territory and force the Alemanni to do what Valentinian wanted them to do, around 374 the emperor gave up and came to terms with his enemy, recognizing Macrianus as the rightful leader of the Alemanni and promising to respect their territorial claims. It was a bitter but necessary pill for Valentinian to swallow. It was a necessary pill because in the middle of 374, Valentinian received a full report on how operations were going along the western Danube frontier. The answer, as we just saw, was a resounding, really not well. Marcellianus had hightailed it out of the area, and the commanders of the border legions were pointing fingers at each other, concentrating far harder on covering their asses than actually dealing with the barbarians in their midst. This was clearly going to take the presence of the emperor to sort out. So Valentinian made plans to leave the Rhine for the first time in nearly a decade. When he finally departed, it would be the last time that a senior Augustus would make his headquarters in the western half of the empire. It had already come as something of a surprise that Valentinian had taken the west as his territory in the first place, since at this point in history it was neither economically nor culturally as rich as the east. And going forward, no powerful emperor would make the mistake of basing himself in Gaul when he could base himself in Constantinople. The Eastern Empire had its problems, sure, but look around. The West is a decaying, poor wreck. Who wants any part of that dump? Maybe Stilicho could have done something with it had he been given a chance, but that is a what-if comic for another day. In the spring of 375, Valentinian arrived on the Danube frontier and surveyed the damage. He didn't need any more reports to tell him how bad things had gotten. When he arrived at the key military city of Carnuntum, he found it a ghost town. With the army out in the field, the inhabitants had fled for their lives. But though things had gotten out of hand, it wasn't that bad. As Theodosius the Younger had shown, the Romans were more than capable of dealing with a few barbarian invaders. They were just doing a really crappy job of it in Illyria. When word got around that the emperor was now in the area, even the barbarians had to admit that, yeah, maybe we have been taking advantage of the situation. Switching immediately from raising hell mode to abject groveling mode, representatives of the Quadi and Sarmatian showed up at the imperial court begging forgiveness. They laid out their case against Marcellianus and swore up and down that had their king not been murdered, that none of this would have happened. The emperor, through intermediaries of course, promised to investigate the matter so he could decide for himself who was to blame and who should be punished. But the members of the imperial court were not typically in the habit of siding with barbarians against the son of a praetorian prefect, and so when the investigators came back, they reported that the Quadi had been completely out of line and were 100% to blame. Verdict in hand, Valentinian announced that he was going to punish the Quadi for their unprovoked invasion of Roman territory. He gathered up an army, and in the late summer of 375, he launched a punitive expedition into Quadi territory, crossing the Danube near modern Budapest. He spent the next few months successfully punishing the barbarians for something that, yeah, they had done, but really, wasn't Marcellianus's just awful diplomacy really to blame? As winter approached, the emperor withdrew back across the Danube and moved a bit upriver. It seemed that that would be the end of Valentinian's campaigning for the year, but for reasons unknown, it appears that he changed his mind and decided to keep going with a winter offensive. In November of 375, having been battered around more than enough and ready to put an end to the fighting, envoys from the Quadi once again showed up at the imperial court, begging forgiveness and asking what it would take for the emperor to desist. Satisfied that the barbarians were now showing the proper degree of humility, Valentinian's courtiers informed the Quadi that the terms would be the standard arrangement. Provide X number of young recruits for the legions each year, and there will be peace. The Quadi agreed, but before they went back home, they once again humbly requested a personal audience with the emperor. Breaking with his established practice, this time Valentinian agreed to meet them. But as we will see next week, it was perhaps a good thing that the emperor had kept himself distanced from the barbarians for all these years. However, before we get to that fateful meeting, we must turn our attention back to the east. We left Valens off 2 episodes back, firmly in command of the Eastern Empire after defeating Procopius in May of 366, and now we're up to November of 375. So what had Valentinian's brother been up to for the last decade? Twiddling his thumbs and waiting for Adrianople? Hardly. The Eastern Empire, though stronger and richer than the Western Empire, was not exactly a bed of roses. So next week, we will cover the adventures of Valens, as he deals first with unruly Goths and then presumptuous Sassanids. With the latter being a far more powerful and far more organized threat, the Eastern Augustus tended to focus all of his attention on the Persian issue, especially because Shapur was causing so much trouble in what has to be by far the most important, technically neutral little kingdom in the history of the world, Armenia.